The Duchess of Edinburgh, historically renowned for her unshakable composure and steadfast loyalty, stared down at the crisp, imposing parchment laid before her, her eyes drifting slowly from the demanding signature line to the glaringly vacant leather chair, situated precisely where her designated independent legal representative was strictly mandated to be sitting. And in a deliberate move that boldly defied decades of deeply ingrained royal protocol, she slowly slid the heavy gold fountain pen directly back across the polished mahogany table toward a visibly stunned King Charles. This was absolutely not a momentary hesitation. It was not a polite request for a brief recess to clarify a minor point of confusion, and it was certainly not a subtle display of routine caution. It was an absolute, unyielding, and direct refusal to sign her name to the binding Crown document. And that is exactly where the tightly controlled narrative of this seemingly standard royal procedure shatters into something genuinely fascinating, because this unprecedented act of public defiance did not come from a rogue, unpredictable member of the family who historically thrives on generating chaotic tabloid headlines and endless public friction. For decades, Sophie has meticulously crafted a pristine reputation as the monarchy's ultimate quiet fixer, the incredibly reliable cornerstone who consistently shows up, executes her grueling duties flawlessly, absorbs the crushing institutional pressures without a single complaint, and never ever causes an unflattering front-page scandal or leaks to the press. So, when she is the one decisively snapping the leather-bound folder shut, holding the sovereign's furious gaze without blinking, and firmly stating that she will absolutely not authorize the transfer without her legal counsel physically present in the room, every single courtier, private secretary, and senior official breathing the stifled air of that office immediately understood that something profoundly serious, and potentially scandalous, had just been dragged into the unforgiving light. The meticulously prepared document was laid wide open. The high-ranking witnesses were already positioned in their designated spots like chess pieces, and Charles had comfortably taken his place at the head of the imposing table, fully expecting a perfectly routine, rubber-stamp formality to conclude the morning's business. But instead, he was met with a stark, immovable confrontation that would mercilessly expose exactly how the dark, bureaucratic machinery operating behind palace doors actually manipulates royal decisions. King Charles had officially convened his most senior household representatives inside a highly secure private administrative office on the Windsor estate to formally finalize what absolutely everyone had been repeatedly assured was a brilliantly straightforward property transfer. This specific, highly anticipated estate agreement was explicitly designed to permanently settle the incredibly complex logistics of who would actively administer a massive, historically protected crown property, who ultimately controlled its daily operations, who bore the immense financial burden of its upkeep, and who carried the crushing legal responsibility for its future trajectory into the next generation. Sophie, standing alongside a deeply concerned Prince Edward, had been widely expected to provide the final, authorizing signature, the ultimate concluding step in an exhaustive bureaucratic process that absolutely everyone in the royal orbit had comfortably assumed was already a completely settled matter. Charles confidently slid the final heavy parchment page toward her, placing a priceless silver-capped fountain pen right beside her right hand, waiting for the inevitable, compliant scratch of ink on paper. She read the highly dense signature clause once, her eyes tracking the archaic, convoluted legal phrasing, then read it a second time, and the suffocating, heavy silence that rapidly descended around that massive table must have been absolutely unbearable for everyone trapped inside the room. Then, she calmly closed the heavy folder and pushed the pen right back toward the monarch, leaving it resting dead center on the polished wood. Every single witness in the room instantaneously understood that the carefully orchestrated meeting had just violently fractured beyond immediate repair. Charles stared at her, his expression rapidly twisting from polite, sovereign expectation to total unadulterated bewilderment and rising anger. He had perhaps anticipated a few minor logistical questions, or maybe some nervous, last-minute hesitation regarding the sheer scale of the financial commitment, but he never, in his wildest imagination, expected an outright, unyielding refusal from his most trusted, historically compliant sister-in-law. To the reigning monarch, The incredibly tense moment felt like a brazen, direct challenge to his absolute authority, delivered intentionally and humiliatingly in front of his most senior, observing household staff. The king had already officially approved the parameters of the signing ceremony, personally summoned the high-ranking witnesses to attend, and confidently treated the entire transfer as a completed victory for his newly streamlined monarchy vision. Her sudden, jarring rejection threatened far more than just the immediate property agreement. It directly threatened his unquestioned command over the room itself, striking a painful blow at the very core of his sovereign pride. Yet, sitting there under the crushing weight of his furious gaze, Sophie wasn't actually feeling defiant or rebellious in that agonizing moment. She was experiencing an emotion much closer to profound, sickening betrayal at the hands of the institution she served. Independent legal counsel, the entirely separate, unbiased legal advisor specifically appointed by the Crown to objectively explain binding obligations to her without secretly serving the king's private financial interests, had been unequivocally promised to be present at this final meeting as a condition of her participation. That was the foundational, non-negotiable agreement holding the entire delicate negotiation together. Yet, the designated advisor's chair remained glaringly, disturbingly empty, and absolutely no explanation, apology, or excuse had been offered by the palace staff facilitating the meeting. Nobody had politely whispered that he was stuck in heavy traffic, nobody had suggested they wait a few minutes for his arrival, and nobody had offered to have him join the proceedings via a secure remote video link. The chair was simply empty, a gaping void at the table, and everyone else in the room seemed entirely prepared, almost suspiciously eager, to aggressively proceed with the binding signing anyway. And that is exactly when Sophie, reading the text closely, discovered the hidden, predatory clause that changed the reality of absolutely everything she thought she knew about the deal. The final, printed draft sitting on the table covertly granted the monarch's private office vastly broader, almost limitless tyrannical power over exactly how the historical estate could be utilized, who was permitted to enter its grounds, which specific staff members could remain employed, and exactly how the crushing financial responsibility might legally pass to future, unsuspecting heirs. Those deeply restrictive, highly controlling terms had absolutely not appeared anywhere in the preliminary copy she had painstakingly reviewed and agreed to just 48 hours earlier. That is the critical, undeniable detail that elevates this entire situation from a simple administrative misunderstanding into a deliberate, calculated deception by the palace machinery. We are not talking about a harmless typo, a misplaced comma, or a minor wording adjustment meant to clarify a boundary line on a map. We are talking about entire, sweeping provisions that magically materialized between drafts, provisions that drastically shifted ultimate control back to the king while maximizing her and Edward's personal financial exposure in ways that would legally paralyze them and drain their resources for decades to come. When the reality of her refusal fully set in, Charles instantly erupted with fury, demanding in a booming, intimidating voice to know exactly who had covertly encouraged her to resist him. That singular, explosive question tells you absolutely everything you need to know about how the king was psychologically processing this unprecedented defiance. He did not ask her what alarming details she had found in the text, nor did he ask why she was suddenly so deeply concerned about her future security. He immediately, reflexively assumed that some outside agitator or rival faction had gotten in her ear, entirely convinced that she couldn't possibly have reached this rebellious conclusion on her own merit or intellect. Sophie met his blistering anger without looking away, her posture remaining perfectly rigid and unbroken. No one had instructed her to halt the proceedings. She answered with icy, terrifying calm. No one needed to. Then, with devastating precision, she reached into her leather carrying case, withdrew the earlier agreed-upon draft, and placed it directly beside the heavily altered, deceptive document. Two completely different versions of the exact same binding agreement, containing vastly different operational terms, were now sitting right there on the table, exposing the blatant lie for everyone to see. The outright refusal had effectively stopped the signing dead in its tracks, but the mystery of the missing, silenced advisor and those secretly changed pages were about to explosively expose exactly why Sophie had entered that grand room, fully prepared to stand her ground against the fury of the king. And honestly, when you take a step back and actively look at what was promised versus what was actually happening in that room, the entire facade of royal efficiency falls apart in a way that raises terrifying, much bigger questions about who was genuinely controlling the flow of power and documentation behind the throne. Sophie had spent 20 long, grueling years transforming herself into one of the monarchy's absolute safest pairs of hands. She intimately understood the crushing weight of duty, the absolute necessity of discretion, and the incredibly heavy, personal price of saying nothing when the illusion of family unity demanded absolute silence from its members. That incredibly steadfast loyalty is precisely why her sudden refusal struck Charles so deeply and provoked such a visceral, explosive reaction. This was not a habitual, media-hungry rebel seeking attention, nor was it someone who enjoyed creating friction for the sake of drama. It was one of the royal family's most historically dependable figures deciding, in real time, that blind obedience had finally reached its absolute limit, and that blindly signing the manipulated document could severely, irreparably damage not only her own future, but Edward's as well. She had painstakingly built her respected place inside the inner circle of the royal family through unwavering reliability, not rebellion. She attended the most difficult, emotionally draining public engagements. She supported the king unwaveringly during moments of intense public uncertainty, and she rarely, if ever, allowed her private discomfort or exhaustion to manifest as public tension. That long, unblemished history mattered immensely because Charles simply could not easily dismiss her calculated refusal as mere carelessness, a fleeting bad mood, or a selfish desire for the spotlight. When the ultimate trusted confidant physically pushed the golden pen away, everyone in the room intuitively understood that she had uncovered something severe enough to risk throwing away decades of painstakingly built goodwill. You simply do not throw away 20 years of being the family's reliable rock over a minor, easily fixable disagreement. Edward, standing nervously in the periphery, had intuitively understood the profound danger before the meeting even officially commenced. In the hushed, echoing corridor just outside the estate office, Sophie had opened the newly revised agreement and pointed a trembling finger directly at the heavily altered, hidden clause. The deceptive document would legally bind them to exorbitant, long-term maintenance costs that could bankrupt them, surrender their control over lucrative charitable access, force them to accept unwanted household appointments dictated by the king's staff, and impose draconian rules governing exactly who might inherit these crushing future duties. Those were absolutely not mere ceremonial promises meant to look good on paper. They were binding, legal traps that could permanently shape their private finances, deeply affect their children's future social position, and severely limit their personal freedom for years. Edward read the dense, legalistic wording slowly, processing the trap, then looked toward the heavy, closed oak door and asked the terrifying question that had probably been forming in the back of his mind since Sophie first showed him the glaring discrepancies. Does Charles actually know this has been changed? Sophie could not answer with any degree of certainty, and that profound silence frightened her husband far more than the predatory clause itself. Because if Charles did actively know about the deception, then they were being deliberately, maliciously pressured into accepting ruinous terms they had never agreed to by their own sovereign. And if Charles didn't know about the changes, then someone else deeply embedded in the system was secretly rewriting legally binding documents in his name, fully counting on his unapproachable authority to force total compliance from the family. Neither option offered any comfort whatsoever. Edward deeply feared that directly refusing the furious king might permanently weaken their fragile standing within the wider royal family. He knew from bitter, historical observation how quickly a moment of reasonable caution could be weaponized and mistaken for outright disloyalty by a paranoid court. Yet, he also knew with absolute certainty that his wife was being aggressively asked to accept massive, life-altering obligations that neither of them fully understood, all while being deliberately stripped of their right to counsel. The prince desperately wanted to protect their hard-won standing, but he could not in good conscience ask her to sign blindly, throwing their future away merely to preserve polite appearances for the staff. Sophie felt completely trapped, crushed between two competing loyalties. She desperately wanted to protect Edward from the fallout of a massive family conflict, but she also desperately wanted to believe that Charles, the man she had supported for years, would never knowingly place them in such profound legal and financial danger. Her deep sadness in that room stemmed directly from the breaking of that fundamental belief. The monarch had always publicly and privately valued her sharp judgment. Now, he seemed absolutely furious to the point of eruption simply because she had dared to actually use it. That is the exact part of this narrative that makes this whole situation feel so incredibly off and deeply disturbing. If someone has spent literally years proving their absolute loyalty and sound judgment, and then they suddenly raise a highly legitimate, well-documented concern, the reaction from the top should never be blind anger. It should be immediate curiosity. The terrifying fact that it wasn't curiosity suggests something else, something far more sinister, was driving the frantic urgency of the signing. Charles remained entirely alone in the suffocating silence of the room after the disastrous meeting finally collapsed. He stared blankly at the untouched signature line on the parchment, his simmering anger deepening rapidly because Sophie had neither hesitated in her delivery nor offered a single word of apology for the disruption. Her absolute, unwavering certainty made the refusal feel incredibly deliberate, almost strategically prepared in advance. It was then that Edward quietly admitted something to her that he had fearfully withheld. A highly placed, senior palace official had quietly cornered him earlier and aggressively advised him not to ask too many pointed questions about the revised agreement, claiming the king simply wanted the transfer completed as quickly as possible, without any unnecessary friction. That chilling warning fundamentally changed the entire perspective of the crisis. Sophie began to deeply suspect that Charles's explosive fury was not solely the result of wounded sovereign pride. Someone highly influential inside the palace bureaucracy was desperately racing against a concealed, unknown deadline, using the king as a battering ram. To truly understand why the signing had suddenly become such a frantic, urgent matter, she would have to mentally return to the initial estate visit, where her inherent trust first morphed into dark suspicion. The conflict, as it turns out, had not actually begun at the mahogany signing table. Its true hidden beginning occurred 3 weeks earlier, during a seemingly routine private weekend inspection of the sprawling estate, when Sophie, acting on instinct, opened a locked records cabinet and discovered that several large rooms intended exclusively for public charitable work had been secretly marked on a map for restricted private royal use. Charles had personally, verbally assured her that the entire property would remain a shared, collaborative family responsibility dedicated to public service. Yet, the hidden papers inside that dusty cabinet suggested a completely different, highly restrictive reality, and one incredibly tense conversation that followed later that afternoon ensured the issue could never again be brushed aside or treated as routine. Sophie and Edward had originally been asked by the Crown to oversee a massive historic royal estate where high-profile charitable events could be hosted, while a few selected rooms remained discreetly available for very limited family use. The first original agreement generously gave them full operational responsibility, but strictly protected them from personal financial exposure if the estate ran a deficit. Crucially, it also explicitly guaranteed an independent legal review, meaning a completely separate, unbiased advisor would meticulously examine the terms before either of them accepted any binding obligations. That specific guarantee of independent review is absolutely crucial to the story, because it was the one vital safeguard that would later be quietly, maliciously removed from the process. Sophie had entered the property inspection expecting practical, mundane questions about roof repairs, staffing levels, and public access routes. Instead, she found a sealed, highly confidential property schedule buried inside the cabinet. A property schedule is the detailed, binding list showing exactly which rooms, hidden entrances, and vital facilities belong under each specific person's direct control. Several lavish private apartments, The highly secure archive room and the estate's grand principal entrance were heavily marked as being exclusively controlled by the king's private office, rendering her authority over the estate effectively useless. The shocking discovery changed the meaning of absolutely everything they had been told. Sophie carried the damning schedule directly into the library and bravely placed it right before Charles. No protective aid stood between them. No smooth-talking secretary could soften the blow of the question. She asked him directly why she and Edward were expected to accept the crushing financial and operational responsibility for the entire massive property when they would have absolutely no real authority over some of its most important, central spaces. That is a completely reasonable, logical question. If you are being explicitly asked to manage and pay for the upkeep of something, you should probably have unfettered access to all of it. Charles read the page without showing any visible surprise, his face a mask. He stated coldly that certain sensitive areas simply had to remain under absolute sovereign control, the monarch's direct, unquestionable authority over royal property, and he sharply warned her not to turn a practical, administrative arrangement into an emotional test of family trust. The king firmly believed the restriction was merely protecting the long-term interests of the crown. She heard something far more painful and dismissive. Accept the heavy burden, do the grueling work, but do not ever question the absolute power hiding behind it. Sophie tried to reason with him once more. She told him that genuine trust could not possibly require her to sign a document blindly first and only discover the ruinous financial consequences later. Charles abruptly ended the conversation by forcefully closing the folder and turning away. That dismissive gesture became the absolute point of no return for their working relationship. Later that same evening, the promised palace legal advisor contacted Sophie through a highly secure, documented private message. He urgently confirmed that the restricted room schedule had absolutely not been attached to the original version submitted for his initial review. The frantic warning definitively proved the change was not a minor oversight. It radically altered who carried the ultimate responsibility and who retained the actual control. Days later, that exact same crucial advisor completely disappeared from the final signing arrangements without a single word of explanation to anyone. The highly controversial schedule was then deliberately hidden deep inside a much broader, highly ambiguous clause designed to confuse the reader. So the one person who professionally flagged the massive problem was surgically removed from the equation, and the problem itself was buried in dense, impenetrable legal language explicitly designed to be overlooked by a tired reader. That is not a mere coincidence. That is a sequence of highly deliberate, malicious choices made by someone with immense power. Sophie entered the final meeting knowing exactly what had been changed behind her back. Charles, however, did not know that she carried both the original and altered drafts, nor did he know she possessed the missing advisor's written, documented warning. When those conflicting versions were finally placed side by side on the polished table, all royal politeness collapsed instantly, and the furious king was forced to confront her face to face. Charles arrogantly expected her resistance to eventually soften and crumble once the room had been emptied of the staring staff. Instead, Sophie's resolve became even firmer. Behind heavily closed doors, the king aggressively demanded that she return to the table, pick up the pen, and complete the agreement immediately before the delay reached the gossip mill of the wider household. She did not raise her voice in response. She did something infinitely more dangerous to his authority. She calmly opened both drafts, pointed directly to the altered ruinous clause, and politely asked him to explain the massive difference. In that terrifying instant, unchecked royal fury met a form of quiet, unbreakable resolve it could not simply command away or intimidate. Charles angrily dismissed the few waiting officials who lingered and ordered Sophie to remain behind alone. Edward stayed nervously outside in the hall, close enough to understand that the intense conversation had become deeply personal and dangerous, but too far away to protect either of them from the fallout of what came next. The monarch intimately knew that every single delay threatened the complex estate planning, halted vital staff appointments, derailed scheduled charitable programs, and embarrassed his wider global property strategy. To him, one stubbornly unsigned page could throw months of meticulous, expensive preparation into total disorder. The king stood aggressively beside the table and ordered her to reopen the folder and sign. Sophie remained seated, entirely unbothered by his height. She deliberately placed the earlier agreement right next to the final version and slowly circled the new, draconian control clause with her finger. The massive difference was no longer hidden inside careful, dense wording. It sat glaringly between them in stark black ink. Charles viciously accused her of intentionally humiliating him before his loyal household. He yelled that she could have easily raised her petty concerns privately, behind the scenes, instead of dramatically refusing at the exact moment of signature in front of an audience. The deep anger in his voice carried far more than just bruised authority. It carried genuine, deep-seated injury. Sophie answered him without retreating a single inch. Humiliation had never been her goal or purpose, she stated calmly, but blind loyalty and family affection could not, and would not, replace legally binding protection. The once trusted confidant firmly reminded him that the convoluted estate agreement would legally bind her and Edward for years, potentially ruining them. She stated she could not, and would not, accept such massive obligations simply because refusing them made the atmosphere in the room temporarily uncomfortable for him. Charles then asked the one question she had deeply feared. Does Edward support this defiance? Sophie absolutely refused to let her husband become a pawn or leverage in this power struggle. She told the furious king that the decision was entirely hers, the refusal was hers alone, and any resulting consequence or punishment should fall on her shoulders alone. Edward would not be used to force her hand. Then, she delivered the final blow. She produced the printed, written warning. Sophie carefully explained that the suspiciously missing legal advisor had contacted her through a documented private message and explicitly instructed her not to sign any revised agreement without independent counsel physically present to protect her. Charles read the printed words once, then again. His entire expression drastically changed, the fury draining into something resembling shock. The king appeared to fully know the terms had been revised for his benefit, but he genuinely did not know that someone in his staff had actively removed the very person expected to challenge them on Sophie's behalf. That is exactly where the narrative gets incredibly weird and terrifying. If Charles personally approved the harsh revisions, why was the critical advisor removed entirely without his knowledge? If he didn't approve the harsh revisions, who on earth authorized them in his name? Either way, someone deeply embedded in the system was operating completely outside the official chain of command and using the absolute authority of the king as a convenient cover for their own agenda. Charles closed the heavy folder with both hands, the fight draining from him, and formally declared the signing suspended. Sophie looked directly into his eyes. It was suspended the exact moment the advisor failed to arrive, she noted. Outside in the corridor, Edward saw a panicked senior official hurry away, carrying the unsigned, disastrous agreement. The greater struggle had now rapidly moved far beyond a family argument and toward the shadowy officials who were actively controlling exactly what Charles saw, signed, and believed to be true. The monarchy often projects the grand illusion that it moves solely through the singular will of one sovereign, but absolutely no royal decision ever reaches a signature line entirely untouched by bureaucracy. Behind Charles stood an army of ambitious private secretaries, ruthless property managers, calculating financial controllers, and cunning legal advisors, each carrying a tiny piece of delegated authority that could easily be hidden inside a single, weaponized sentence. Sophie's quiet refusal had spectacularly exposed the grinding machinery operating beneath the crown. The decisive question was no longer whether she had disrespectfully defied the king, it was whether someone had maliciously manipulated a binding agreement while relying on his terrifying authority to completely silence any objections. Charles summoned the terrified senior property secretary before the day even ended. The sprawling estate agreement had passed through property administration, private finance, household operations, and finally, the monarch's secretariat. That final office was the elite team directly responsible for preparing decisions and vetting documents for the sovereign. Each department had touched the paper, but only one of them had maliciously widened the disputed clause to trap Sophie. The king placed both drafts squarely on his desk. "Did Sophie receive the version I actually approved?" he demanded. The secretary hesitated, sweating under the pressure. He looked nervously at the earlier copy, then at the final, altered document, acting as though the answer might magically change if he just waited long enough. It did not. "No, sir," he whispered. Charles said absolutely nothing, the silence deafening. The secretary nervously admitted that the wording had been vastly expanded immediately after the tense weekend inspection. He weakly claimed the drastic change was designed solely to protect sovereign control, meaning the crown's lasting, absolute authority over royal property, even if Edward and Sophie's responsibilities later passed to their children. Without that secret safeguard, he desperately argued, future family arrangements might permanently weaken the monarch's iron grip over the estate. Charles understood the structural concern. He absolutely did not accept the deceitful method. The king held the final authority, but he relied entirely on these advisors to clearly explain legal consequences, honestly manage revisions, and ensure that every single document perfectly matched what he had actually approved. Now his sacred command had been hijacked and used to aggressively pressure Sophie into signing ruinous terms she had never properly reviewed. His blinding anger gave way to something far more painful, deep, institutional embarrassment. Sophie waited anxiously with Edward in a nearby quiet drawing room. She could hear frantic footsteps echoing beyond the closed door, but no discernible voices. The heavy silence left her completely uncertain whether Charles was aggressively investigating the unauthorized alteration or coldly preparing to punish her for her public refusal. Edward tried valiantly to reassure her, yet he could not hide his own creeping fear that their secure place within the family hierarchy had permanently shifted for the worse. Then, the terrified secretary disclosed the final, damning secret to the king. The palace legal advisor had vehemently objected to the altered clause because it placed massive, unfair responsibilities on Sophie while severely limiting her operational control. He had aggressively demanded that she receive separate, independent legal representation before signing anything. That ethical demand had made the entire process slower, more difficult, and much harder for the bureaucrats to control. So, he had simply been removed from the meeting schedule. Let that terrifying reality sink in. The advisor was removed specifically because he ethically insisted that Sophie should completely understand what she was signing. That is not administrative efficiency. That is deliberate obstruction dressed up as standard procedure. Charles stared blankly at the staggering admission. The choice before him was incredibly brutal. He could stubbornly defend the rogue officials who had acted in the powerful name of the crown, preserving the illusion of infallibility, or he could humbly admit that Sophie's defiant refusal had actually protected him from unknowingly approving a deeply flawed, predatory arrangement. The king's fury had finally found a new, deserving target, but the unsigned document was already creating massive ripples and consequences that neither he nor Sophie could effectively contain. By the following morning, the sprawling estate was no longer preparing for a grand celebration of the transfer. Staff appointments were instantly frozen in place. Lavish invitations were hurriedly withdrawn. A massive charitable launch scheduled for the following month vanished completely from the royal calendar. The unsigned document had rapidly become far more than a petty family disagreement. It had ground an entire royal operation to a complete and highly visible halt. Yet, the greatest damage was entirely personal. Sophie returned to her home, knowing logically she had protected herself and her family, while deeply fearing that Charles would forever remember only the humiliating moment she physically pushed his pen away. The palace formally and quietly paused the entire estate transfer until an independent legal counsel could thoroughly review the disputed clause. That meant absolutely no new staff could be appointed, no maintenance spending could be approved, and no charitable program could move forward. Confused employees preparing to relocate were abruptly told to remain where they were, while several prominent organizations received careful, vaguely worded notices stating their highly anticipated events had been indefinitely postponed. Sophie carried the heavy estate briefing folder into her private room and removed it slowly from her bag. For weeks, that thick file had represented deep trust, renewed purpose, and a massive new responsibility she genuinely believed she could serve with immense pride. Now, it felt deeply contaminated by pressure and deception. She placed it inside a dark drawer and turned the key, locking it away. Edward watched her in supportive silence. "You made the absolute right decision," he said firmly. Sophie desperately wanted to believe him. Yet Charles's furious, humiliated expression at the signing table would not leave her mind. She had seen intense fury, but beneath it, she had also seen genuine, deep hurt. The trusted confidant deeply feared that her one necessary refusal had permanently damaged a vital relationship built over years of quiet service, unshakable loyalty, and private understanding. Edward gently reminded her that signing blindly would have damaged far more than just feelings. It would have destroyed their autonomy. He understood exactly why she was shaken, but he also knew with certainty she had protected them both from ruin. Charles received the grim consequences in a sterile list. An aide nervously read the names of the numerous charities negatively affected by the cancelled launch, while the king stood silently beside a large window without interrupting once. His blinding anger slowly, painfully gave way to profound regret. The monarch had deeply wanted the estate transfer to become a shining symbol of stability and modern royal efficiency. Instead, it had become undeniable, glaring evidence of extreme disorder and manipulation inside his own household. Then, a calculating advisor foolishly suggested portraying Sophie to the press as being confused about standard procedure to save face. Charles refused immediately and forcefully. He knew that publicly blaming her would exponentially deepen the injustice and brutally force Edward to publicly choose between defending his wife and protecting his place beside the crown. The king would absolutely not create that toxic division merely to protect fragile palace pride. Charles ordered a full, merciless legal audit, a formal, sweeping review of every single draft, internal email, handwritten instruction, and meeting record connected to the disastrous transfer. The damning results arrived later that very day. One specific margin note stopped him cold in his tracks.